Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of In Conversation with Counseling Today. I'm the editor in chief of the Counseling Today magazine, and today we're going to speak with three mental health professionals who specialize in career counseling and working with people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. We featured this topic in our group consultation department in the May issue, which I'm going to show. So you can look there, and we have all of the guests we have with us today contributed, as well as three other counselors. And that was talking about kind of sharing their thoughts on how clients, helping clients with ADHD achieve their career goals. And when I did that, as I was researching the topic and speaking with all of the counselors who contributed, it was a very fascinating topic. And they all were saying, I wish I had more words. I wish I could speak more. And so I really wanted to kind of dig in and extend the conversation. And so three of the contributors have agreed to come on and talk more about this topic. And today we're going to specifically dig into the common barriers that people with ADHD often face throughout their career development and some practical strategies that counselors can use to help them address these challenges. But first, let me introduce our guest today. We have Dr. Cheryl Hamilton, who is a licensed professional counselor and the executive director of Hamilton Counseling and Consulting in Duncanville, Texas. She's also an ADHD certified clinical services provider. We also have Liz Pauley joining us today, who is an assistant professor and computer engineer co-op advisor at the University of Cincinnati. And she is presenting on this topic at the National Career Development Association Conference in June. And we also have Dr. John Thomas, who is a licensed professional counselor and the founder and director of the ADHD College Success Guidance Program in Fairfax, Virginia. He's also the author of Thriving at the Edge of Chaos, Making ADHD a Superpower in College and Career. So thank you all three for joining us today for this exciting conversation. And I was going to kind of kick off the conversation today to talk about, how does ADHD affect someone's career development? How does it affect their perception attitudes toward their careers? So I thought that could be a good way to jump in the conversation. So whoever wants to kind of talk about what they've noticed with the clients they work with.
Sure, I can go. Well, first I want to bring out the positive in that I know a lot of people with ADHD, and including my students, who are using their strengths related to ADHD and absolutely are thriving in their careers, and they're great fits for them and are super fulfilling. But on the other hand, the effects of these symptoms are not necessarily unique just to career decisions or perceptions, because it starts in grade school. I think some educators are really amazing at leading neuro-inclusive classrooms, but the education system today, professional world in general, is just not that ADHD friendly. And people with ADHD are given messages from childhood that they need to be still for very long periods of time and focus on a droning lecture or a single media static lesson, which can be super difficult. And because of that, some people may default to thinking, I'm not good at school, therefore I'm not going to be good at the job. And it can hit their confidence a little bit.
Liz, I have to agree with you. I love that you started out with the positives because I think that's the most important. I think when we think of ADHD, everybody kind of looks at it from a negative perspective. But when you have the right tools in place, I think that they definitely can thrive. I've actually seen a lot of my clients thrive in that area. One of the biggest things that I've seen as barrier is because I guess when they're thinking about careers, especially like she was saying, like going from grade school to college and then in your career, there's this time that is related to it. So everybody wants you to be there at 8 a.m. and clock out at 5 p.m. And so they're looking for a lot of flexibility, in which I think right now with us having the opportunity to work from home, that has really been good. But also when you are able to identify like your peak time of where you thrive really well at, and then you can look for careers that provide you with a little bit more flexibility in your schedule.
Well, to Cheryl's point, I think that's a big piece of it is, yeah, we get messages in school, you got to sit still, and jobs, the world of work requires, certain structures that may be hard to rise to for people with ADHD. But when we think of those call them symptoms of ADHD, and let that guide some of our career choices, there's a lot of places where the energies of ADHD show up as potential superpowers and career settings that are just perfectly conducive to kind of novelty and variability that we seek in ADHD, like being a therapist is you're not going to be seeing the same person all day long, for example. So a lot of that is very important to be considered when making a career choice. And some of the stuff that we've gotten, as Liz mentioned earlier on in high school and even through college, may remain as challenges, especially in areas of critical thinking, executive function, emotional intelligence. Those those come back up different stages for us to rework as we move forward in life.
Yeah, I really appreciate y'all. I had a question about strengths, but y'all went right there because I think there are a lot of strengths, and we do talk about this in a negative light, and it like it's a problem and or challenge, and then there's so many benefits to it. So, I mean, another thing I know, our counselors often struggle with is assessment. So, do you have any advice on how counselors can best assess any strengths, weaknesses, challenges that each client has? What are there any tools that you have or questions that you often like to ask when you're working with clients with ADHD?
I know for myself, I go straight to the executive function assessment. That is like my go-to tool that I use because it allows them to definitely identify those strengths and those weaknesses in those areas. And then it also allows you to come up with a plan of how you can, work through it, meet your goal, but also consider the barriers and give you different strategies when those barriers come up. I wish that executive function was talked about years ago, when people were just now starting to get into ADHD. But now I feel like with on jobs and in careers, I feel like that is actually an assessment that people should use every day, even if you don't have ADHD, because everybody needs to know where they can grow, where they're functioning at their highest performance level.
To the point of assessments, that one of my pet peeves is that the assessments make sense to people like us who are trained to understand them, but people with ADHD as a consumer do not understand them necessarily. And a very important part is that I've found in the work is creating a language that empowers people to speak to the subjective nature of ADHD personally, and that language also helps them to acquire tools that can help to remediate it. So but that's one of the challenges I see with the assessments that I don't know, it's necessary for us as professionals to understand, but the challenge for us then is to help our clients to understand.
I think I usually go with a pretty solutions focused approach when talking with students, asking questions like, when you lose track of time, what are you doing? And it's okay if they say playing video games, we're going to explore that a little bit more. Or when do you feel most fulfilled? When do you feel most confident? What do your friends compliment you on? Helping them see their own strengths. And then usually what they're presenting me with is weakness. That's when they're coming to me and asking for help. So they're pretty self aware in that. But if not asking, what do you struggle with the most on the job or in the job application seeking process? And they're usually pretty self aware and could tell me, and when we can come up with things to help them there.
I love your point, Dr. Thomas, about kind of changing the language. Is there any example that you kind of have, like a hands-on one of how you may be assessing as a clinician, but then how are you going to kind of give that to the client in a way that they can kind of, or just any kind of example of how someone with ADHD may process things the way that you're speaking about it a little differently?
Oh, at the risk of hawking my book, there's a certain we call them heuristics that they're like software programs that we offer students to accommodate for whatever aspect of ADHD is getting in their way. One of the examples is dreamer, realist, critic. It's a way of thinking about three parts of ourselves. There's a creative part we call the dreamer. The realist is the part that can pick what's most important of those ideas and make it a goal, and then sequence a plan and execute the goal. And the critic is the part that can dissociate and step back and monitor the self and say, hey, what could go wrong here? What can I do to improve this? And it's a sort of a tool that's a language of its own. There's different pieces of it that help to both assess and empower the student with a tool that they can apply. That's an
Yeah, that's a good one. I don't know if anybody else has an example too. I thought that was an interesting point, but yeah, thank you for that one. So I also want to kind of transition. I know that a part of our thing was talking about the barriers and that. So we could start off by talking about, what are some of the stages? I mean, I like you make a great point about how this happens kind of throughout the lifespan. But when it comes to the actual particular kind of career stage and your career development, what are the stages in particular that maybe someone with ADHD has struggled with? Is this goal setting? Is it preparing for an interview? Is it finding the right career that fit? Like, I know that Dr. Hamilton talked about, making sure the time and things like that. Like what components do you find are often very, common? And I know that everybody's different and it varies, but are there kind of common themes you see that people with ADHD often struggle with when it comes to kind of career planning and career development?
I would say a lot of these things that you listed: goal setting, resume writing, negotiating, preparing for an interview, researching a company, getting ready to network, all of that is pretty low dopamine behavior. Those are pretty low dopamine tasks where the gratification is much delayed. It is going to take a long time in a lot of these activities to get the reward. And so I think that makes it trickier for people with ADHD, seeing that this could be further down the line too. And I would love to get the other panelists' input on this too. I know there's not a ton of research on this quite yet, but there's a lot of overlap about ADHD and then increased sensitivity to rejection. And I anecdotally see it a lot in my ADHD students of the fear of rejection keeping them from even hitting send on a job application. And that's something that we talk about a lot too. And I have different strategies to address it, but I would love to get people's perspectives on that too.
I I just was talking about that topic the other day, and I know you said it's not a lot of research because I think that a lot of people who have ADHD or who are struggling with the symptoms of ADHD, they often come presented with a lot of self-worth that is very low, low self-confidence, low self-worth. They struggle with even the self-awareness because they've been focusing on so many times believing what others have said to them who don't know that their struggles, or who don't know that they have ADHD, that it really has put them in a space of where they feel like they can't do it. So it's almost like the can't attitude. I cannot do that. I'm not good enough, And so then we have to work through those things. Well, when you think about what you were just saying, Liz, the rejection of it all, well, because now this fear has created so much anxiety, now they don't even want to even pursue the type of career that maybe they would have been great for. So I've seen a lot of times where they settle for something that's very easy versus going forward and doing things that they really dreamed about or had, their mindset to do.
Oh, there's some work that William Dodson has done on this. He terms it rejection sensitivity dysphoria. And his theory is that everyone with ADHD has RSD. And this rejection sensitivity dysphoria can be at least destabilizing, if not disabling. And in the areas you mentioned, like just hitting send or applying for a job or thinking, am I capable of doing this? And paradoxically, the greatest antidote to RSD is knowing about it. So I think just bringing it to the awareness of our folks we work with is helpful, but it also opens the door to some of the other similar challenges, like I think Liz maybe someone alluded to earlier. Over time in our history, we get a lot of negative feedback about our behaviors as people with ADHD, and those form into narratives and narratives into beliefs that become self-evident. We don't challenge them and automatically say, no, I can't do this. Or maybe even in a job, we say, well, it may cause us to be less efficient in our work. So those are a couple of different areas that seem related.
Yeah, those are all great points. And I think just the validation of that sometimes is nice because you think again that when you don't hit send, you don't do those things, that it's also like, oh, that's me. I'm just not good enough. I'm not confident. And it's that, kind of a cycle of just the self-worth problem. And that's really interesting stuff. So, kind of digging in some of the common barriers. I mean, what are some of the I guess, common barriers to, like, setting goals or things, or what are some of the common challenges like this that you're talking about, and how do you help them? What are some strategies, any kind of strategies that you have? So maybe you could even talk us through, like, here is a set, barrier I've had with a client, and here's a way that I would kind of, tackle that or approach it, to help them learn how to empower themselves. How do they hit send? How do they get over the rejection? Because it's real, and, like, this fear of rejection can just, make you not move and not make you go forward, as Dr. Hamilton was saying, you don't chase those dreams, right? So, yeah, what are some of the common things or an example of a barrier and how maybe a practical strategy to overcome that?
I'm gonna say, and hopefully you all agree with me, but there sometimes the goals that they're setting, they're very impulsive, but also they're not realistic. So I want to graduate from college, and as soon as I graduate from college, I want to make $100,000. And I'm like, okay, so tell me a little bit more about that. So we literally have to work through when you graduate from college, what does that look like for you? And so what I like to do is just take it one step at a time. If we're focusing on college careers, let's first focus on doing a career assessment to see where you thrive at the most, and then goes from, okay, I know I'm in my last couple of years of college. I know I'm going to go off to be, say, a doctor or continue on to, go to college. What do I need to do to prepare? Because I think that's the part that hurts hurts them the most, the clients that I work with, is the preparation phase. And I don't know if anybody else agrees with me, but I think in their mind, I go to college and then I'm done and my life is going to be great. But then there's a preparation phase in between that you really have to work on for you to get the outcome. And then you have to understand the time. I like to go back to time because I feel like the time um, is unrealistic as well. So in 3 years, I'll be doing XYZ. I'm like, okay, let's look at how you can crawl before you walk. So I think that has a lot to do with them being very impulsive, but helping them to slow down, if that makes any sense.
I, I agree 100% with what you're saying, Cheryl. That's the real finding realistic goals is a vital, and then how to accomplish them. And I think of this. I use this old quote: "We trip over pebbles, never over mountains." But I add to that, we don't climb mountains because they're too big, and so that captures the opposites of with people with ADHD. For example, tripping over pebbles. One of the most commonly failed courses in college is that 1 hour college orientation because it's so easy and people trip over it. I've got people that have taken it 3 times and they're making A's and everything else. So mountains are vast. So the thing the solution metaphorically is we need to create stones. You build pebbles into stones and chunk mountains down into stones and sequence them. And how do you do that? And when people start thinking in those sort of ways, it gives them more opportunities to be successful at what you pointed out is can be very, very challenging in preparation.
I'll throw in another quote that I like. By the yard, it's hard. By the inch, it's a cinch. If you are trying to accomplish this giant goal without any kind of specifics, it's next to impossible to go forward. So setting weekly goals is helpful to get to the big picture, and even daily goals of what can you do today to break it up, I think is really important when you're talking about career goal setting. I'll also go back to the fear of rejection or failure. I have some students who struggle with this because that can directly impact career setting, career goal setting. Do the failure log from the Designing Your Life folks at Stanford. And they go through every day for a while and they mark the failure or the mistake, whether it was a true weakness, a pattern of behavior, or this was a one-off, just a screw up. It was a screw up, and this is what I learned from it. So then they have to identify the insight and growth opportunity from that. And it's almost becoming immune to failure. Of this happens every single day, big and small, and I'm okay, and I can get through it. I think that builds some resilience that is really needed in career goal setting. And also another thing, this is career goal setting, but also the actual job search itself. The number one most effective tool I've found is body doubling, is sitting with somebody while they are career goal setting and talking through it. So you hear what's going on in their thoughts, not just homework of, okay, go write goals and bring them back to me. You're there with them. And even in the job search, okay, you're afraid to hit send. Like Dr. Thomas was saying, why? What's going on there? Let's talk through it so that we can identify the barriers to going forward. But being in the room with them while they're doing this instead of saying, do this and see me next week.
Yeah, that's all great. I love these quotes. These are they're gonna hang them up my wall. I like them. But it really does seem like setting those small realistic goals, and that taps into what you mentioned earlier about like the dopamine, right? Like so having those like I feel like I'm winning, I feel like I'm succeeding. So it's not just college to $100,000 job. But how do you get there? How do you build those little pebbles? I love that. So then kind of thinking about the actual career, the job search, the job process. I mean, that no one likes the job search and the job process. So that's a common problem we all have. So then what are the specifics here? I mean, is it again kind of realistic goals and expectations, or is it finding that will and desire to do that? What are the barriers here and any practical strategies on helping them with things, like the writing the resumes or doing an interview or just even finding the right fit in the job and just not settling, like I think Dr. Hamilton said earlier sometimes. So I'm like, well, this is easy. I can do this. So yeah, what about with the job search and kind of dreaming big, I guess?
I am so into resource sharing. And I think sometimes it makes students feel even better just to know there are resources for people like me, and they're heavily utilized. So in the job search itself, there's a few really great job boards that I recommend. So mentra.com is one of them. And so this is a job board where a candidate only fills out one profile. They list everything that they want the employer to know. If the employer posts a job on it, they are agreeing to a set of neuro-inclusive practices, including things like if they interview a candidate and they don't hire them, they have to give them feedback. They must deliver feedback to them. So this is not just for ADHD folks. This is also for people on the autism spectrum, any kind of neurodivergence. But I think it's doing the part and putting this on the employers, because I do mock interviews with students, which is another strategy to kind of take that anxiety down and get them practicing. But I also, part of my job is working directly with employers that hire my students. And so I make sure I'm coaching them on inclusive interview processes. I could spend an hour talking about that because our interviews are not set up today for neurodivergent folks. So making sure I'm articulating to employers, it does not matter if they cannot maintain eye contact the entire time they're talking to you or their leg is bouncing. You want them to program a computer, make sure the questions focus on that. So I think it takes educating industry too. I mentioned body doubling being really effective. And there's also an app called FocusMate, where if you're not there, a student can log in and you meet a stranger and you say, this is what I'm accountable to for the next hour. You stay on camera, you're not chit-chatting, and they're asking you how it's going. You're holding other people accountable. And it's not just for people with ADHD, but there's a high overlap, and that brings community too, I think. And then there's one more resource I'll share, and then I'll stop talking, is Jobs for Humanity. So that is another job board. So employers that prioritize neuro inclusion, but it also features free career coaching for those who are neurodivergent or have a variety of disabilities, and community. So a community of career coaching that can hold you accountable, but also talk about what's going on and feel like more relatable too.
Yeah, that's great. I love how you work with employers because it's so true. I mean, you could only do so much. I know it's very frustrating sometimes. You help a client in session, but then if the world's not built for them, how far, so I'm glad that and hope that maybe more counselors can kind of do that work so we can build worlds that are more inclusive and that, have different interview standards. Because I feel like as it comes to careers, we're very stuck in an old way of thinking of how we interview, how we find candidates. And I'm excited to see where it's going to go. Like, what's our future going to be as we kind of evolve with technology and expectations of people.
I think Liz hit it on the nail. I mean, those were some great resources. I'm over here writing them down right now. I love the psychoeducation, not only for the clients, and that's exactly what I do, but also just with the employees, the employers, like you were saying, Liz. I think that is so important because I think sometimes employers can be stuck in those traditional ways, but when you're looking for someone with a certain skill set, I love that she says, if you want them to really just work on a computer, don't worry about the eye contact. They're here for a job, the job that you're hiring for, hiring them for. And then I'm wondering, but I also say this in my counseling sessions with my clients who I work with who have ADHD. I usually tell them, sell your talent and your skill, because that is what's going to get the job. And so we do role plays where I'm helping them to kind of focus on, what are you good at? Now sell that piece, when you're in the interview.
Mm. I think of the part of the interface on this that is the greatest challenge, of course, is in the system itself. It's difficult for people to interface, the neurodiverse people to interface. But looking at the other side, what can we help them to do to empower them to deal with that the divergence there? And one of the concepts I work with is uh, that there's three ways of being that have to do with any attempts at success, because that could always result in failure. Like the average, I think of hearing today is you're going to apply for 26 jobs before you get one, and that means 25 times you fail. So how do you deal with failure as an issue? One way to deal with it is to be fragile. The other is to be resilient. And then there's what Asim Talib called anti-fragile. And there's times to be all three of these. Um, Anti-fragile, though, is that part that is where we learn from failure, kind of like the failure log that Liz mentioned. What is this a pattern of in me that I can identify and work with? Let me be fragile and accept that. Let me be fragile and say, yeah, I have ADHD, and here's how it affects me. That requires being fragile, acknowledging our fragility. Resilient is how we deal with that, how we keep moving ahead despite it. And then anti-fragile is how we learn from the failure. So those are three concepts that I've found that help on this end of the interface within the world of work.
Yeah, that's a great segue into kind of thinking about setbacks, because careers are setback. I mean, you're going to have times that you're excited and times there's a setback, and it may be that something in your own life is holding you back and you can't go for what you want to. It could be that your employer is not giving you the credit or the opportunities that you need. And I know that that can be very challenging for all of us. But so thinking about, clients with ADHD, how do you help them? Are there other, advice there? That one's a great one, thinking about how you're coping with failures and things like that. But setbacks, and it can even be setbacks like, I really wanted that promotion and they're not offering it. I wanted that raise, and how do I advocate? Because they're not valuing me because they, only see some part of me, but I'm more than that. So those type of setbacks where you really, you want something and you feel held back, is there any advice there to kind of empower? Um, and are there any setbacks, I guess, also thinking that are related to directly kind of ADHD and this negative view that our world still has with neurodivergent people? Are there ever times that they're, a setback that is directly related to that and linked, and how can you empower them to embrace who they are and like use that and address it, because that can be scary sometimes to address, hey, I'm processing this a little differently than you, but that doesn't mean I don't get that promotion. I don't get that job.
I know I have had several clients in the past who would walk away from a job because they didn't get the promotion because they didn't know how to advocate for themselves. Um, and I think that's number one, learning how to advocate for yourself, learning how to be okay with getting accommodations on a job. I know this is something that I think is fairly new as far as with ADHD, but more people are asking for those accommodations, depending on what type of job they're doing. But not being afraid to talk about it, like, I have ADHD, this is what it looks like, and helping their employer understand what they're going through, but then also helping them to see that it is not a deterrent of them not being able to perform their job, you know. So I think maybe psychoeducation is really good um, when it comes to talking about the accommodations, but also, um, you know, advocating for themselves. learning how to advocate for themselves.
A quick follow-up on that would be, when is a good time? I mean, is it, you're right. I think that that's so, like, I'm going to speak up. I'm going to tell people, how I am and advocate for myself. But when do you do that? Do you talk to the manager? Do you do it HR? Kind of, are there any, tactics there that you found successful for your clients of when and how to really, talk about, the different ways that you may process or need any accommodations at work?
For my clients, when after they've got the job, I tell them to talk to HR about those accommodations. I help them to understand that they don't have to say everything to their manager because that's not their business. That is why HR is there. So teaching them, the protocol of what to follow, I think that's important. And I've seen success with that, going to HR instead of saying, waiting and then something happens and then they go to their manager. And of course, their manager may not understand, but I feel like if you go straight to HR, then that's going to help you in the long run.
Well, sort of a parallel to that is in college. Sometimes students want to wait till they get in have problems with a course before they go into student disability services and say, hey, I need accommodations. And so the question of when do I disclose that I have a neurodivergence? Do I have ADHD? What does that mean? And when do I disclose it is very important. And I think it goes back to that, the first step of that is that self-knowledge, understanding how ADHD shows up in my life. If I don't understand that fully, it's hard to extrapolate that into this position that I'm applying for. And at that point, it may be an issue that once you have a sense the job is to be offered, you might want to disclose at that point and do so in a way that raises this issue that this is something I've bumped into in the past. Here's how I've accommodated for or worked through that, and so that I don't see it being an issue here, but I may need to ask for some accommodation. Now, do you do that? At what stage of the interview or the hiring process do you do it? It's always a hard question. But again, I think understanding ourselves is a really important first step.
And I actually went to a presentation at NCDA last year, and it was led by an ADHD consultant, and she was also an attorney. And so I had just asked the same question, when should someone disclose? And she said, honestly, not until you have the offer. Because even though discrimination is illegal, people will do it. People have their own biases on ADHD, and you want to wait till you have that power and focus on your strengths until then. But I actually, I did an informal survey at UC, and over 100 STEM students who identified as neurodivergent took it. And I actually wanted to read a couple quotes from it about accommodation and disclosing, because I think it's helpful to have. So one student said, standing up for myself after asking for accommodations hurt my status. I was not invited back as a direct result. Another one said, I have not yet told my employer I am ADHD and dyslexic because I'm worried it will affect their thoughts of my performance since I write code. Another one said that I had so many challenges at work. I'd hide in a bathroom, stairwell, supply closet, and I would cry when I couldn't get things done on time because the office was so distracting, and I'd get sidetracked every time someone stopped me from finishing a task just to talk. I have a 3.5. I'm intelligent. I just can't work in these environments. And I hear these kinds of comments all the time that are not positive about asking for accommodation. So I want to validate that it is real and it is scary, but it does not have to be. I always go through, so askjan.org, the Job Accommodation Network. They have a wonderful menu of accommodations that are considered reasonable, and it's a reputable source in the field. So if a student can go through and say, oh, this is actually the accommodation I need to succeed, it's going to be so different for anybody with ADHD. Everybody needs different things, but being able to have that conversation and just say, this is my diagnosis. These are accommodations that the Job Accommodation Network recommended that I think would be very helpful for me. Having that as soon as you start so you can get ahead and avoid a lot of setbacks is very helpful.
Yeah, those are great points. I mean, I think that it speaks to the stigma that we still have. And I'm hoping these conversations and the work that y'all are doing with both the clients and the employers will help to remove that. But it really is. It's one thing to say, I know I have a lot of strengths, but it's another thing to say, when do I disclose it and how, and what's the feedback going to be? What's the reception of that disclosure? Which is another thing of failure, and kind of leads back to that. You feel rejected again, right? So these are all great resources and great things that we're doing. I'm going to be respectful of time and kind of see if there's anything that y'all want to talk about, let me know. But another question that I guess we could kind of talk about and ask would be kind of the strengths again. I'd love to return to that. I mean, I think that that's such an important point, and I know y'all touched on some strengths. Are there any other, strengths with terms of career and, doing that you've noticed that people with ADHD have to kind of, to, give them that confidence, to know that it's not just, I need accommodations or this, but what are some strengths that you've noticed with clients that you've worked with?
I can speak from the engineering perspective because there's a huge overlap of strengths there. Something I see so much in my ADHD engineering students is creative problem solving. So your brain is neurodivergent. You are going to think of things differently than the majority, which is such an important skill in engineering, diverse solutions. And I've seen hyperfocus be a huge asset too. So I have some students who tell me they can do an entire coding task in a day when it usually takes a colleague a week to do it, because they are interested in it. Therefore, they're locked in and they are cranking it out. They are able to hyper focus on the task in front of them. That's a couple I've seen.
I've noticed that when you have the convergence of some of the call it superpowers of ADHD in a career, that people thrive in it. I have a friend who does cyber security for two different companies, and he runs his own company, and he's like, it's a convergence of passion, hyper focus, motivation that's drawn by, in part, the variability, the life meaning that he gets out of this. So a lot of times it's a combination of factors that help a particular personality to fit well into a position that makes it a real hand in glove sort of thing. And that's an art, not a science, at finding that connection that comes from self-awareness and who I am, what are my values, and what drives me in life, and then an understanding of the world of work. That seems to be the most important connection I've found.
John, I'm over here smiling because you are so correct about that. But then when you put you and Liz's statement together, the creativity of it all, like being okay with being creative and being different, because the difference is what makes something unique and great. I've worked with dancers before in the past, ballerinas, and once they get into their flow, it is amazing, like the artwork that they come up with, the choreography of the dance, So here they are, they probably were struggling with those core classes, but then once they got out there and was able to be that artist that's within them, that's where you see the beautiful work really begin. So I think as a person, you definitely have to be self-aware, but also understand, like John was saying, your superpower is so unique that it could take you anywhere you want to go. You could do amazing things in life.
Those are great points to end on. I'll ask one final question, but that may be the take home right there. I was going to kind of think about just turning toward, people who may be watching this who have ADHD. What are practical tips or anything that you advise? I mean, it sounds like from what we just talked about, really finding your passion, finding what motivates you would be a good tip to do that. And then set up little steps along the way. Those were kind of things I gleaned from this conversation, like set up little challenges and rewards of how you're going to get to that place where you're, excited. But are there any other practical tips that you have thinking about careers for anybody, who has ADHD?
Mm-hmm. I'm going to say just take one step at a time. And again, me and Tom, set realistic goals, take one step at a time. It's almost like when you teach younger kids how to follow directions, you only give them one step directions. Stop going from 1, 2, and 3 directions. Only focus on that one thing that you're going to do, and then set realistic goals and give yourself time. I think that's important.
I think for me and watching students, what's helped them the most is finding community. So whether it is using FocusMate to talk with other people that are struggling with focusing, or Jobs for Humanity, or just other students, it can be an isolating experience to have ADHD when the world is not set up for you. So talking with other people who do have it, I think helps them feel less alone, and also gives an accountability system too. And yes, I agree with Dr. Hamilton and taking small steps, very specific small steps, and having someone to celebrate those with and focus on achievements is super helpful too.
In addition to that, I think one of the ways of thinking about the folks we work with is I try to convey the sense that you're a work in progress, and you're evolving, you're becoming, as you get into this next step and you succeed or you're challenged, some aspect of you, new aspects of you will emerge, and to expect that, and to expect to incorporate that, and what's important to you may change as a result of it. And so in addition to the sequence of steps, something of an expectation of continued growth, because that's one of the things that I've noticed about people with ADHD. We think about adult learning and the need for continued education. We tend to be that type of person. We're always wanting to become more, know more, grow more. That goes with that drive for variability and a novelty. And so that just kind of setting that expectation in a positive direction, I find is useful.
Well, thank you all. This has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot, and I really have enjoyed this. And I appreciate you taking the time to share some awesome tips and resources for clinicians who are working with these populations. So thank you again.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
This program is copyright 2024 by the American Counseling Association. All rights reserved.